Hello, and welcome to this training on how to conduct fact-finding interviews presented by the Advocates for Human Rights. My name is Amy Berquist. I'm a senior staff attorney in the International Justice Program at the Advocates for Human Rights. And with me today is my colleague Jennifer Prestholt, who is Deputy Director of the Advocates and also the Director of the International Justice Program. What we're going to talk to you about today is information that will help you prepare for conducting interviews as part of a country assessment related to the death penalty. But the advice we're going to give you today is relevant for all sorts of fact-finding interviews. So even if you're not part of the team doing these death penalty country research projects, you may want to stay tuned to get some tips about how to do human rights fact-finding interviews. Our agenda is first we'll talk about the purpose of the interviews, and that's specific to this particular project. Then we'll talk about methodology, and then we'll go into the nuts and bolts of doing a good interview. So first of all, the purpose of the interviews for this particular project. One of the purposes is to learn about the organization's death penalty work. The organization you're reaching out to has been identified either because it's a member of the World Coalition or because you have identified it as an organization that is active on death penalty issues in the country you're studying. So you want to learn a little bit about that organization and specifically the work it does on the death penalty. It might be the only issue the organization focuses on, or it might be an organization like the Advocates that focuses on several different issues, one of which is the death penalty. So be sure to learn a little bit about that in your interview. Most important for purposes of this project is the second purpose, which is to gain expert insights regarding the inflection points that we've talked about in prior trainings and in the template. You're supposed to, in your research, look at the past 15 years in the country and inflection points, turning points with respect to the death penalty, either in a positive or negative direction. So you want to, after you've done your desk research, you want to double check with these experts to see whether they have the same impressions you do about those inflection points. Did you miss some? Do they disagree about when those inflection points took place or what they were? You also want to get their expert insights about the contributing factors. What were the causes of those turning points in the country with respect to the death penalty? They may have a different perspective, having lived through it, being on the ground, than you would have based on the research that your team has already done. You also want to get their insights about indicators. What were the warning signs or the positive signs indicating that the country was going to go in one direction or another? Does the expert have the same opinion you do based on the research you conducted? And then, of course, you want to get their expert insights about what they perceive to be the future of the death penalty in their country in the next 5 years. And you may say, maybe you're looking at a country that's abolitionist. And one of the things that happened in the last 15 years is they ratified the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or they abolished the death penalty under their domestic law. And you might think, well, everything's done, nothing further. But there are some countries that have done those things and then taken a big step backward by repudiating the second optional protocol or by reinstating the death penalty. And so you'll want to hear from your experts that you interview about what they perceive to be the future of the death penalty in the next 5 years. Do they see any warning signs? Is there any danger? Or on the other side, if the country still has the death penalty, what do they see as the possible avenues for moving closer to abolition in the country in the next 5 years? Another purpose of the interview is to fill in gaps from the research template that you've been using to conduct your research. Now, I really want you to try to use secondary sources to complete as much of that research as possible. But to the extent that you find things that are not clear or unable to identify particular laws or things like that, you can tap the expert knowledge of the person you're interviewing to try to fill in some of those gaps. And you may also, and these are sort of side purposes for the interview, identify potential new members of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. It's possible there are organizations doing great death penalty work and they don't know about the World Coalition, or they haven't thought about joining the World Coalition. So you may want to mention that to them, or you can just mention it to us in your memo. Say this organization is doing good work. You may want to try to recruit them to join the World Coalition. You may also want to, in this interview, use the interview to identify additional organizations or experts to interview so that you can fill out the remaining gaps in your memo based on the template. So now we'll talk about methodology. And this some of these things your team has already done. Step one is to conduct all the other research in the template and do some initial analysis about what are the inflection points. Was there just one over the last 15 years? Were there several? What were the contributing factors or the causes of those inflection points from your perspective? And then what were the indicators? What were some of the warning signs or signals that the country was going to be making a shift in its position on the death penalty? And you want to be in a position when you're conducting the interview to show the person you're interviewing that you've done your homework, that you understand the domestic context, you understand a lot of the history of the death penalty over the last 15 years, so that the interviewee doesn't get frustrated thinking they have to explain everything from point zero when you're doing the interview. That way the interview can be a lot more succinct and efficient in accomplishing the goals that we talked about. The second step is going to be to identify the non-governmental organization or organizations you want to interview. First would be if there's a World Coalition member based in the country or a coalition member that's more of an international member that does significant work in the country. And you can go to that link there to peruse the list of members of the World Coalition. There may be other local NGOs doing anti-death penalty work in the country that you've identified through your research, and part of the template shows you how to dig up that information. And then only if you can't find local NGOs should you pursue the possibility of interviewing other international NGOs that might have some expertise to share. But if you can get at local organizations or World Coalition members, then there's not really a need to reach out to these additional international NGOs that wouldn't have the level of expertise that the local folks would have. Next is contacting your targeted NGOs. If it's a coalition member, you can ask me to do an email introduction, and I will do so. Be patient. If I'm getting a lot of these requests at the same time, it may take me a few days to make those connections. If it's not a coalition member, then you should try to track down the contact information and just do a cold ask. Reach out via email. You may want to try calling to see if you can talk to someone, but do be persistent and creative, especially during the pandemic. It may be hard to get a response right away. In some countries, there are different standards for responding to unsolicited emails. So you may need to be persistent. You might need to try to track down the organization on Facebook or other social media platforms to try to get their contact information. Or it might be that you track down that this local NGO has done work with this international NGO, and maybe we can work through those contacts to try to get a specific person, a specific email or telephone number to reach out to. Step 4 is figure out what the best means is going to be to conduct the fact finding. Will it be a telephone or Skype or Zoom interview? Will it be some kind of a chat format online? Do you want to conduct the fact finding via email or prepare an online survey? Is there some other means to conduct the fact finding? And another consideration is to figure out whether you need an interpreter. And oftentimes people will say, oh, it's okay. But you want to make sure that the person you're interviewing is as comfortable as possible. So if they are more comfortable speaking in a different language, then do your best to identify somebody who can serve as an interpreter for the interview. Next, of course, is conducting the interview, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And then you also want to document the information gathered during the interview. We typically, as we'll talk about in just a moment, recommend that 2 people conduct the interview, one as the lead interviewer and one as the primary note taker in the interview. But you want to make sure that you document the information that you gather, have a write-up of the interview. And then after you've done that, you may need to repeat steps 3 through 7 for the new organizations that you've identified during your interview, or you may have multiple NGOs you've already identified. And then the final step is to incorporate the interview findings into your team's memorandum. So that memorandum that's based on all of the research to cover in the template, make sure you incorporate those findings into the memorandum that you prepare. So next, we're going to jump into talking about interviewing. And the first step is preparing for the interview. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that you've almost completed all of your research based on the template, and that you've already done your analysis of the inflection points, contributing factors, and indicators. You already want to have an idea in your mind about what your conclusions are going to be in the memo, and then you'll use this interview to sort of hone what you've developed as your position. It might be that you have a position and your experts tell tell you you're wrong. So be prepared for that, but keep an open mind. But you want to be able to come to the interview with some ideas already in your head. Outline topics you want to cover in the interview. And you have, I believe you have sent out to you an example of a sort of written interview list of questions that we prepared. You can use that as guidance, or you may want to tailor the interview based on the research that you've done and your initial conclusions. Generally speaking, you want to be respectful of the interviewee and let them decide the time of the interview, what means of communication you'll use. As I mentioned before, if possible, 2 people should conduct the interview, one as the lead questioner and one as the note taker. We don't recommend that you record the interviews. That can be a bit off-putting for the person being interviewed, that they feel like they're being put on the spot. And then arrange for interpretation if needed. So now I will hand off to my colleague Jennifer to talk about what happens when the interview begins.
All right. Thanks, Amy. And thanks to all of you for volunteering your time on this project. I think this kind of large scale fact-finding project is a good example of how working with pro bono teams can allow the advocates to have a much greater reach and to talk to many, many more people than we would be able to do with just our staff members. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the basic principles of human rights fact-finding interviewing. They're applicable to lots of different kinds of human rights fact-finding, and we just adapt them to a specific project such as this one, where you'll be speaking primarily with people that work at non-governmental organizations or NGOs. So one of the things that we always remind people right at the beginning is to make sure that you have the full names and contact information of everyone that is in the interview. Since these will be remote, depending on the format that you use, you might have to ask who else is in the room, but it's really helpful to make sure that we know everybody that has participated and have the contact information in case we need to follow up with additional questions. So at the beginning, you always want to do what you can to try to build rapport and be transparent about yourself and your role as a volunteer. And also to explain a little bit about the World Coalition and the Advocates for Human Rights. You also want to describe briefly the purpose of the project. And again, transparency is really important. So you want to make sure that you are very clear about your explanation of how you will use the information that they provide. You're going to want to explain carefully what you can and cannot do with the information. And this is the principle of not raising expectations. And so, we're going to take back this information and do a report or a memo for the advocates, but you want to be careful not to promise that you will, take specific action or do specific things. And that goes to the next point, which is that you never want to make promises that you can't keep. And so there might be an occasion where the NGOs have questions for us. And so you can always say, I'll take your question and take it back to the advocates in the World Coalition. But that's what you want to do instead of saying, yes, I will. I mean, some promises you might be able to keep, such as I can send you this report, I can, do this, but just make sure that you're not making a promise that that the advocates or the World Coalition or you yourself cannot follow through on. And that goes to the trust and rapport building and transparency in the relationship. So we are keeping these are internal memos. We'll be keeping them confidential. So please do assure the interviewee that that we'll maintain confidentiality to the best of our ability. That also goes to creating trust in an interview format. And we do want to document the interview, as Amy said. Our methodology at the Advocates is generally not to use recording devices. As Amy mentioned, that can actually influence the interview. People are less likely to be sort of more conversational or be more careful about disclosing things if they know that it's being recorded. And then this is, of course, we're not gathering evidence that will be used in court, so we don't actually have a need to record. So that's part of our methodology. And let's go to the next slide. But do take careful notes. And that's part of the careful notes piece is the other piece of our methodology is we would encourage you to have two people involved in the interview so that one person can actually ask the questions, and then the other person can take the notes and focus on taking the notes. So again, general principles for human rights fact-finding during the interview are to establish that rapport and to maintain eye contact and speak directly to the person that you're interviewing unless there are cultural reasons not to. So you want to be a little bit sensitive about that. So part of your research has been into the country, and so you can ask us, you can raise questions with us if you have concerns about that. But just be aware of that. Another thing, and this applies especially if you're working with an interpreter, but speak directly to the interviewee. So using their personal pronouns as opposed to talking through the interpreter and saying, ask them what they ask them what they think about this. So that sort of direct eye and eye contact and oral communication. You want to be very careful to ask not only open-ended questions, but questions that are phrased in a neutral manner. Similarly, you want to make sure that you're avoid making judgmental or evaluative remarks. This might not happen in the context of these particular interviews, but in some fact finding, if you're interviewing a government official or something like that, you might you might feel like that they're overstating something, or but in the context of doing the interviews, you just want to make sure that you remain very, very neutral and let the person that you're interviewing share their thoughts. Do be patient, especially if you're communicating across different cultures and different languages. You might need to restate and try to restate in a different way if they don't understand you. Would just be really patient and flexible during the entire interview. Do not interrupt the interviewee. This is particularly important if you're working with someone who is the victim of human rights abuses. These particular interviews are focused a little bit more on the work of the NGO and the context in the country generally, but you never know who you're talking to and what their experience is. And so you might be talking to someone who is the survivor of human rights abuses, or has a family member, who's on death row or who has been executed. So just be aware of that and try to let the interviewee drive the interview and the process, and share the information that they feel is important to share. So you never want to push the interviewee. Sometimes you can tell that something's a little bit sensitive. I usually just sort of make a note and try to circle back to it later. Sometimes as people grow more comfortable through the interview process, and that rapport has been established, they're willing to talk about it later. Of course, we want to be sensitive to any cultural differences. And I think I mentioned this, but being creative, Amy definitely mentioned this, you be very creative and flexible in the process. You might go in with your outline and your list of questions, but then you might sense that there would be a good way to get the information that isn't in your list of questions. So do follow up on that. And then know when to stop. So, you can always schedule a second interview, if the interviewee is looking tired, and given the time, there might be a time difference too. So, it could be late at night when it's daytime here. So just be sensitive to all of that when you're doing the interview, and try to give the interview as much control as possible. So you can say, would you like to stop now or take a break? And then, as I said, maybe schedule a second interview if you're getting a ton of really great information. So interview questions, we've talked a little bit about the outline, and you have a list of potential questions. More generally, it's helpful in fact-finding interviews to ask open-ended questions that give the individual the opportunity to, as I said before, share what they see as most important. Um, you always want to start with the non-controversial and less sensitive questions. So more general kinds of questions, maybe about their NGO or something like that. How long have you been in existence? You know, how many staff do you have? Things like that. Um, Language is something that's really important, even if you're not working with an interpreter. If you're not speaking the same language, or even if you're speaking the same language but they're from a different country, there might be different terms. So you want to be very careful in posing the questions to avoid slang and to avoid lingo that might not be easily recognizable. Um, and also to listen to the interviewee, and you listen to some of the terms that they're using. And so you might need to ask for clarification, because sometimes a word has a slightly different meaning, and even in English. Um, so, a South African might use a term that has a different meaning for us in America. So make sure that you ask for clarification of anything that you don't understand, whether it's as small as a word or a term, or if you've sort of lost the or bigger. So if you've lost the train of the where the interviewee is going with the response, just stop and say, "I'm sorry, could you please say that again?" Just be careful not to make the assumption that you understand, or that you'll figure it out later. When you're doing these interviews, this is your opportunity. So to get the information. So try to take advantage of the time that you have with the interviewee. Um, and then finally, you want to avoid leading questions. There are certain, if you're interviewing children, then you do want to use leading questions, but in this context, you're likely not going to be interviewing children. And so you're going to want to, leading questions can just shape the response. And so trying to ask these open-ended, using neutral language as much as possible. So, so you go through the interview, do as much as, follow through with as many of your questions as possible. I've always found it helpful to have an outline, as well as, sort of interview protocol. And then I personally like to categorize them into different kinds of things, so I can sort of skip through. Your note taker, and this is our methodology at the Advocates, to have a second person who can then sort of follow along and see, oh, we missed this category of questions, or oh, we missed, a certain question that would be really important to get the answer to. So as you're coming to the end of the interview, you want to ask your note taker if they have any questions that they want to ask as follow-up. Your note taker might also, have had a chance to identify some other questions that are not on your list that you would want to follow up. It also, for the interviewer, it does then give you a little bit of break to think about, to look at your list and to think, well, let's see, what did I miss, or what did I want to follow up on? Another thing that's really, really important is to always ask the interviewee if they have anything that they would like to add. And sometimes this will, take things, I've had some interviews that have just gone down an entire, like, spent as much time as we did in the first, and sometimes that's just the fact that the interviewee has been thinking about it while answering questions. And sometimes it's again, the establishment of rapport and them feeling more comfortable at the end of the interview to talk about things that might be difficult to talk about. So make sure that you always ask if there's anything else that the interview would like to add, and also give the interviewee the opportunity to ask you questions. And this, sometimes they'll have no questions, sometimes they'll have questions about your work. And sometimes they'll have sort of, I've had random questions about, like, what's your favorite TV show and things like that. So do respond to what you feel comfortable with. If there are questions that you do not feel comfortable answering or don't know the answer to, then you can forward those on to us. Just say that, I'll bring that back to the Advocates in the World Coalition, and we can help you with that kind of response. Again, you want to close the interview with reassuring the interviewee about the confidentiality of the information that they've provided, as well as the identity, and then just do a very short recap of the purpose of the interview and how the information will be used. If there's any kind of follow-up, for example, if they might say, oh, you should talk to my colleague who's not here today, or you should talk to this other organization, or, we've done this report, it would be really helpful for you. Just make sure before you close out the interview that you have a very clear agreement on how that follow-up will happen. And so, state very clearly, I will contact you, or, you will provide the introduction to the colleague, things like that. Just be very clear and make sure that you keep that in your notes, because you would think, that you would remember, but if you do multiple interviews, it's easy to it's easy to forget who you said would do what. Again, making sure that you have the full name and contact information for everybody that was in the interview room, and particularly the primary interviewee, because you might get back and be typing up your notes and realize that you have follow-up questions and want to be able to follow up with that. And then another thing that's really critical is to always ask the interviewee if there's anybody else that we should be talking to. And very often there is. It might be somebody else within the same organization who has a different role, or it might be somebody from colleague organizations or even from another country. So again, making sure that we ask about who else we should be talking to. So after the interview, you want to make sure that you review your notes as soon as possible. And if you took handwritten notes, then you want to type them up as soon as possible. But make sure that you just get them recorded as soon as possible. If you're working with an interpreter, that's especially important, because we don't always have the interpreters available to fill in specific details. So make sure that you do that. What we usually recommend is within 24 to 48 hours. And especially since you won't have a recording to go back and refresh your memory. Do also make notes about your impressions about the interview and about the organization. So if you're really impressed with the organization itself and its work, that's helpful for us to know. Or if you're interviewing more than one person and there seemed to be some dissent between them or different opinions, I think especially with a project like this, it would be helpful to know if there's not sort of a uniform opinion about an inflection point or something like that. You want to make any notes about credibility. This is a little bit less less important in a project like this, because they are sharing their own opinions, but if you really found somebody was not credible, or if you found them particularly credible, that would be helpful to know. And then make a list of those follow-up tasks. Like if you said you would follow up with the NGO or send a report or follow up with the Advocates or World Coalition, make sure that you don't lose those, that you write them down, and that they are communicated. And then, you always want to be really thankful this probably should be in the closing the interview slide, but it's good to have it in more than one place, actually, because these interviewees are giving their time. And so we want to be really, really clear in our thanks to them, and their contributions in their own country for the work that they're doing. And there's a few special considerations that just to keep in mind. You've been doing research into these countries, but just being a little bit aware of the political situation in the country before you go into the interview, so that you can kind of tailor your questions around that. Also with a project like this, we're looking at a lot of different countries, and so there's a very different level of international attention that's directed towards the country. And so some of the countries just may have a lot more media attention about issues, or there might have been events that happened in the country that made it more, gave it more international attention. But some of the NGOs are really working on issues that are not seen by the international community. So thinking about that, as you've done your research, and incorporating that into that awareness into the interview process. Similarly, there are some countries, there are many countries where there's a high level of NGO activity, and civil society is it's an accepted and acknowledged part of life. But there's also many countries, and this is something we're seeing definitely increasing and throughout our work, where the level of repression and restrictions on freedom of expression and association and political participation really have meant that that it's dangerous to work in the civil society space. So be aware of that as you go into the interviews as well. And then again, I said this before, but can't reiterate it enough. Do not make assumptions when you're doing these fact-finding interviews. Ask the follow-up questions, because we are working in a different context here in the United States. And so you just need to sort of be aware that your assumptions might not be correct. And Amy, was there anything you wanted to add on those special considerations?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jennifer. I think that was really helpful. I think there may always be certain sensitivities about the death penalty in particular. So it's useful, like there may be countries where other topics are people feel perfectly fine speaking about, but the death penalty is somehow more sensitive. And so even if they agree to do an interview, they may, like, circumstances may change. They may want to reschedule it. They may want to use a different format for the interview that they think is more secure. So just be aware of those factors and considerations as you're going through with the process of setting up and conducting these interviews. So I think that covers sort of the basics of conducting these human rights fact-finding interviews. As you prepare and go through the process, feel free to reach out to me if you have any additional questions that arise. This, I think, is the most exciting part of the project in my mind, is you've done all the background research, all the hard work, you've done your homework, and now you get to talk to a live human being who has lived this experience that you've been researching. So I hope it's a useful, interesting experience for you, and I hope you're able to gather a lot of additional information from the people you interview. And hopefully this will help the World Coalition build a stronger movement to move toward abolition of the death penalty, not only in the country you were looking at specifically, but in the broader context of how can we move more countries in the right direction. So we're really thankful for your work, and we hope that you enjoy this interview component as kind of the dessert after you've done the hard work of all of the background research and filling in the template research points that you've been doing already. So thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from you if you have any questions or if there are any bumps in the road.